Well, joining us now to discuss the week that was in federal politics and the year ahead, we're joined by the former federal Liberal leader Dr John Hewson and the former New South Wales Labor Premier Bob Carr. Gentlemen, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
Firstly, Mr Carr, we'll start with you, and with this focus on the economy, do you think this is the week that Julia Gillard got her mojo back?
Yeah, very much so. I saw her in the interview on the 7:30 report last night, and I thought she was speaking with that authority in a relaxed conversational style that we've been waiting for. I think that there's hard evidence that talking about the economy and jobs suits Labor. A bit of polling data on that, and I don't think she or Wayne Swan could have been more effective than they were in revving up that theme. In fact, there's an irony here, and that is that the two-speed economy, the difficulty that manufacturing is in because of the roaring growth of the mineral and resources sector, the two-speed economy actually helps Labor rather than hurts it, because the Prime Minister and the Treasurer can talk about action to save jobs in manufacturing, and that is a very, very important part of lifting Labor's appeal, to be strong on jobs and the economy, and in particular to appear to have answers to the challenge that manufacturing industry is facing.
Well, John Hewson, as you know, Tony Abbott was channeling Clint Eastwood this week when we were discussing the economy in Canberra. Is this ground he is comfortable fighting on?
Well, I think it is ground he's comfortable fighting on, but I think they've actually both got it wrong. I mean, they've both embarked on a very high-risk strategy, which leaves the government very little room to manoeuvre if circumstances turn out to be worse than is expected. Both of them are ruling out any capacity for fiscal stimulus going forward. If the economy turns out to be flatter than expected, and both of them have this manic obsession to achieve a surplus as fast as possible, I mean, that eliminates any capacity they have in fiscal policy. And, of course, with the Reserve Bank lowering cash rates, begrudgingly, but lowering them, but the banks threatening to put their rates up if their cost of funds goes up, then the capacity on the monetary side may be eliminated as well. So I think it's a bit of a mindless debate right now on both sides to say we're going to get a surplus as fast as possible.
So, John Hewson, did the opposition miss a beat here by, in the last week or so, focusing on the fallout from the Tent Embassy protest while the government really stayed on message with the economy?
Well, I don't think so. I think it's a point that they had to make and that they were going to make anyway. I'm not sure that there's much more to get out of that issue. So in that sense, I guess you're right. But in terms of the economic debate, I mean, it is going nowhere. I mean, the government, as Bob said, is going to try and make a lot of mileage out of the fact that they are solving problems by worrying about jobs and perhaps creating some jobs. But more broadly, I mean, they are responsible for the two-speed economy. The resources sector's been booming. We haven't really capitalised on that. That hasn't trickled down to the rest of the economy. At the same time, the Reserve Bank has been out there running this interest rate policy, putting interest rates up as far and as fast as possible and holding them there as long as possible, which has basically been the fundamental reason why the rest of the economy is as flat as a tack. And I mean, retail's flat, wholesale's flat, property, construction is flat, manufacturing's flat, domestic tourism's flat, education's flat, large part of the service sector is flat. Now, that is a very difficult set of circumstances to leave yourself exposed to the risks of what might happen in Europe, what might happen with China slowing down, what might even happen in the United States. So I think we are left pretty much as sitting ducks in this country if international circumstances turn out to be more adverse than have been expected.
Well, Bob Carr,
do
you agree with John Hewson there?
Sorry.
Do you agree with John Hewson?
I was going to say that I don't think the federal government, I don't think the Treasurer or the Prime Minister would be so emphatic on this if they weren't buttressed by the strongest advice from Treasury. And Treasury, by and large, has got it right. I think they've figured into their calculations the worst that could happen in Europe, and still they believe that having spent big to protect Australia from the GFC, they're now obliged to honour their word and get us out of deficit spending as they said they would. In fact, at the rate they're going to do that, and it's good news today about the health rebate, at the rate they're doing that, Australia will be more the model economy for the world than it's ever been up till now. We spent big to save us from the GFC, totally vindicated, and we've wound back that deficit spending on target, as the Treasurer said he would when the GFC hit. So I think they look more this week like a government that's delivering on jobs and the economy than they have for a long time. And in fact, there'd be people in the Labor Party saying, why didn't we see this sort of coordination and confidence earlier than we have? But it came in a week when everyone expected the government to be wobbly after the Australia Day incident and the continuing leadership speculation.
Well, those questions could have been asked. John Hewson, just before you go on, as the economic debate raged this week, how despairing were you that the coalition economic leadership team simply couldn't get its line right on when a coalition government would return the budget to surplus?
Well, I think they're committed to turning it to surplus, and their surplus is always going to be bigger than the ALP surplus. That's the line. The difficulty they have is, of course, they don't have the data on which to give a more precise answer. They will get those budgetary numbers closer to an election, whenever that is. And just to pick up Bob's point, I wouldn't be putting my faith in Treasury. If you just look at the way they've missed the budget numbers within this year, I mean, the budget was to be around 12 billion. It's gone as high as 37 billion. It's going to go to surplus next year. I think the Treasury's track record on this stuff is pretty appalling, and I wouldn't be tying my ship to that going forward. And I don't think they have factored in the worst that can happen in Europe. If we have another credit crisis as a result of the banking crisis in Europe, the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, and that impacts on our banks and their cost of funding, that is going to have a very significant impact on this country. And you can say, oh, look, I think the view in Treasury is, look, whatever Europe does, it'll muddle through, and maybe it will muddle through. But it'll muddle through with perhaps an enormous amount of volatility in markets, which make it very difficult to judge circumstances in Australia. And it's that fear, it's that uncertainty that's causing business to step back, to be much more cautious, causing consumers to step back and to be much more cautious. And, we could have a relatively flat period of economic activity going forward, despite all the relatively good statistics you can quote in favour of the Australian economy.
But if you were Federal Treasurer, John, you'd rather be who you are going into an international forum to talk about how your country had performed and how your economic managers, your Treasury had performed, than the Treasurer of any other country on the globe. We've done so well. We said we'd go into a big deficit to save the country from the GFC, and we're on target to get out of that, to get out of deficit spending. And I think I think there's a fundamental credibility there, and I think despite all the distractions the government's had, it's got this fundamental argument about the economy and jobs on far stronger foundations than what you've got on the other side of the parliament, where we saw this week that their three economic spokespersons hadn't been talking to one another about the rate at which they would move back into surplus. Now, that is extraordinary. You've got a pantomime horse opposition. They're three spokespeople battling it out and contradicting one another, and that's too big a gap. I mean, Tony Abbott goes into his caucus room and says, we've got to stop talking about car industry assistance. It shows our divisions. Labor, on the other hand, has got a simple line. We're doing what we can to support manufacturing industry jobs, and that support won't be there under a coalition government.
Now, Bob Carr, you mentioned earlier the leadership speculation. It's the issue that just won't go away for Labor. This morning we've been playing a snippet of an interview with Therese Rain where she neither confirms nor denies Kevin Rudd's ambitions to take the Prime Ministership back. How damaging is this for Labor?
Well, obviously it's damaging. Obviously you wouldn't want it. But I thought Julia Gillard handled it very, very well on the 7:30 report last night when she said simply, there is nothing more I can say about this. The only response the Cabinet can have to leadership speculation is to get on with doing the job, to stand up with confidence at question time and talk about the economy and jobs. And that's what we saw during the week. The only response, I mean, we've seen this before in Australian history. We've seen Hawke undermining Hayden. We've seen Hawke being undermined by Paul Keating. We've seen others undermining Kim Beazley. It's distracting, and the person who's got control over the levers is the person who's making a leadership challenge. They can opt to put out more destabilising speculation and to go quiet. They're the ones at the controls. The person who's being stalked is the person who's got to show resolve and calmness and just get on doing the job to a level of personal excellence. And I think that's what I think that's what Julia Gillard did this week on the floor of the Parliament and in that interview last night.
John Hewson, obviously this leadership speculation plays into Tony Abbott's hands at the moment, but if Julia Gillard does show that resolve and regain some momentum in the opinion polls and the economic debate, questions could very well be asked in Liberal ranks about Tony Abbott's future. Is his long-term leadership sustainable? Of course, we had Malcolm Turnbull popping up on 7:30 as well. I think the line from him was he wasn't going to rule out a leadership tilt this term.
Look, I think the Labor leadership issue is not going to go away. I think Julia Gillard's position is terminal. It's just a matter of time whether they leave her there longer rather than shorter. And, of course, the electorate wants the party to go back to Rudd. The party doesn't want to go back to Rudd. They're in a very, very difficult position. But let's take a hypothetical position. Let's assume Rudd did get up. Then in those circumstances, I believe all the media attention and the public attention would turn on to the Liberal leadership, and it would be Turnbull versus Abbott, and that would be an endless issue if the Labor Party were to solve its problem. If they go to somebody else rather than Rudd, I don't think that's going to be such an issue for the Liberal Party. So, I mean, we are in a position where I can't see how the Labor Party is going to manage their way out of this, but at some point there are going to be those in the Labor Party who say, look, Julia's going off the cliff, we ain't going to follow her, and a change will be made. And the only options are obviously to go back to Rudd, which will be electorally more satisfying, or to try and find an alternative, a Shorten, a Combet, or probably a compromise in somebody like Steve Smith. But then they'd have to re-establish that person's credibility in the electorate vis-a-vis Abbott. And, you know, Abbott's going to look strong right through this period, and I think an early change to Rudd would put the most pressure on Abbott, quite frankly.
OK, John Hewson and Bob Carr, fascinating discussion as always. Thank you both for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.